reality warps and sanity unravels as we dive into the abyss of a troubled mind. Steel yourself for a journey into insanity where appearances deceive and the boundaries between reality and illusion fade. Get ready for Twisted Tuesdays.
The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, uneven light across the interrogation room's gray walls. Betty Monroe sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she stared at the large two-way mirror on the far wall. Her reflection gazed back at her, a haunted, tired-looking figure she hardly recognized. Next to Betty, Doris Fletcher fidgeted in her seat, taking quick, shallow breaths as she tried to stay calm. They both felt the weight of what they had learned about the garden circle in the last few hours. The terrible truth burned into their thoughts.
I can't believe this,
Doris whispered, her voice breaking.
George is dead, and Evelyn, she's not who we thought she was.
A monster,
Betty said flatly.
She's been lying to us, controlling us like we're nothing.
Doris winced at Betty's harsh words, closing her eyes as if to shut out the painful truth.
I trusted her,
she murmured, her voice scarcely louder than the buzz of the fluorescent lights.
I thought she was my friend.
Betty's jaw tightened, anger flashing in her eyes.
She's not anyone's friend,
she said, her voice low and fierce.
She's a liar and a killer, and she'll do anything to get what she wants.
Doris's eyes snapped open, fear clouding their green depths.
What does she want?
She asked, her voice shaking. Betty shook her head, a cold laugh escaping her lips.
Power,
she said simply.
The Garden Circle isn't just some social club or charity group. It's a cult, a bunch of fanatics who believe in something dark and twisted.
Doris's forehead wrinkled, confusion and disbelief battling across her face.
But how could they keep something like that secret for so long? Someone would have noticed, would have said something.
Would they?
Betty asked, her tone sharp and challenging.
Think about it, Doris. The Garden Circle has its hooks in every part of this town. The police, the news, the government, they control it all. Anyone who tries to speak out against them either vanishes or ends up dead.
A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the occasional flicker of the lights overhead. Doris's hands shook as she raised them to her face, her fingers pressing against her temples as if to push away a sudden headache.
I can't believe I was so blind,
she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands.
I should have seen it, should have known that something was wrong.
Betty's expression softened, a hint of understanding crossing her face.
It's not your fault,
she said gently.
They tricked everyone, even me. But now that we know the truth, we have to do something about it.
Doris looked up, her eyes wide and scared.
What can we do?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper.
They're too powerful, too connected. We're just two ordinary women. How can we possibly fight against something like that?
Betty leaned forward, her gaze strong and determined.
We have to try,
she said firmly.
We can't let them get away with this, can't let them keep hurting people. We have to find a way to expose them, to bring them to justice.
Doris's lips trembled, tears filling her eyes.
Betty, I'm scared,
she admitted, her voice cracking with emotion.
I'm scared of what they might do to us, to the people we care about.
Betty reached out, her hand holding Doris's tightly.
I know,
she said softly.
I'm scared too. But we can't let that stop us. We have to be brave, have to be strong. Together, we can find a way to stop them.
As the words left Betty's lips, the lights overhead flickered once more, plunging the room into darkness. A cold, unnatural wind blew through the small space, carrying with it the faint smell of decay and rot. Doris let out a choked gasp, her hand tightening around Betty's as the temperature in the room dropped.
What's happening?
She whispered, her voice quivering with fear. Betty's eyes narrowed, her jaw clenching as she scanned the shadows that danced along the walls.
They know.
She said grimly.
They know what we're planning, and they're trying to stop us.
A deep, unsettling groan filled the room, seeming to come from all directions at once. The walls appeared to ripple and bend, as if the world around them was changing in unnatural ways. Doris's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pressed herself closer to Betty, her eyes wide with terror.
Oh God!
She whimpered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise of unearthly sounds.
What do we do?
Betty's grip tightened on Doris's hand, her eyes blazing with determination even as fear twisted in her stomach.
We fight.
She said, her voice steady and strong.
We fight with everything we have, and we don't stop until we've taken them down.
As the words left her lips, the door to the interrogation room burst open, the sudden rush of light momentarily blinding them both. Detective O'Connor stood in the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and worry as he took in the scene before him.
What in the world is going on here?
He demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Betty stood up, her hands still clasped tightly around Doris's as she faced the detective head-on.
We need to talk,
she said, her voice calm and steady despite the fear pulsing through her.
There's something you need to know about the garden circle, something that changes everything.
Detective O'Connor's eyes narrowed, his forehead wrinkling as he studied the two women before him.
I'm listening,
he said slowly, his tone cautious and unsure. Betty took a deep breath, her gaze meeting Doris's for a brief moment before turning back to the detective.
It's a long story,
she said, her voice firm and resolute.
But it's one that needs to be told, no matter what happens.
And with those words, Betty began to speak, her voice rising and falling as she told a story of darkness and lies, of ancient evils and unspeakable horrors. Beside her, Doris listened closely, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination as the true nature of the garden circle began to unfold before them. They knew that the path ahead would be dangerous, that the forces against them were powerful and far-reaching. But in that moment, standing together in the harsh light of the interrogation room, Betty and Doris knew that they had no choice but to keep going, to fight with every bit of strength and bravery they had. For the fate of Rosewood Falls, and maybe even the world, hung in the balance, and only they could shift the balance towards the light. The pungent scent of turpentine and linseed oil permeated Doris's art studio, mixing with the musty smell of old canvases and the sharp odor of dried paint. The small, cluttered space was a chaotic jumble of half-finished paintings, discarded sketches, and haphazardly stacked art supplies, a physical manifestation of the turbulent emotions that roiled within Doris's mind. As Betty navigated through the clutter, her eyes scanned the walls and shelves, curiosity and unease growing within her. The artwork surrounding her was dark and disturbing, vastly different from the cheerful landscapes and still lives she had anticipated from the gentle housewife. Instead, the canvases were filled with twisted, nightmarish visions of grasping hands and leering faces, of shadowy figures lurking in the depths of inky black voids.
I had no idea you painted,
Betty said softly, her gaze fixed on a particularly unsettling piece that appeared to move and twist before her eyes.
These are very intense.
Doris looked up from the table where she had been sorting through a stack of papers, her green eyes clouded with emotion.
I haven't painted in years,
she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the pages.
Not since I married George.
Betty frowned, understanding dawning in her eyes.
He didn't approve?
Doris shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips.
He thought it was a waste of time.
She said.
He believed I should focus on being a good wife, keeping the house clean and preparing meals.
Betty's jaw clenched, anger sparking in her chest at the thought of the controlling, manipulative man who had stolen so much from Doris's life.
He was wrong,
she said fiercely, her gaze locking with Doris's.
You have a gift, Doris. A talent that should be nurtured and celebrated, not suppressed and hidden away.
Doris's eyes widened, surprise and gratitude flashing across her face.
Thank you,
she whispered, her voice thick with emotion.
That means more than you know.
Betty smiled warmly, her genuine smile illuminating the dimly lit studio.
We're in this together now. Whatever happens, whatever we uncover, we'll face it as a team.
Doris nodded, her fingers tightening around Betty's as determination washed over her.
I'm ready,
she said steadily.
I want to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be.
The moment Doris finished speaking, a sudden gust of wind tore through the studio, scattering papers and canvases in a chaotic flurry. The room's temperature plunged, an icy chill penetrating their bodies. Betty's eyes widened, her breath misting in the frigid air as she scanned the room for the source of the disturbance. Her gaze landed on a large, oil-stained canvas that had toppled from its easel, its surface rippling and undulating as if alive.
Doris,
she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe.
Look!
Doris turned, her eyes widening in horror as she took in the sight before her. The painting, a nightmarish vision of grasping, writhing tentacles and glaring, malevolent eyes, seemed to be moving of its own accord, the pigments swirling and shifting in a dizzying dance of color and shadow.
What is that?
Doris breathed, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the canvas. Betty shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the impossible sight before her.
I don't know,
she said slowly, her mind racing with possibilities.
But I think it's a warning. A sign that we're getting close to the truth.
Doris swallowed hard, her fingers digging into Betty's arm as she fought back a wave of terror.
What do we do?
She asked, her voice trembling. Betty's jaw clenched, her eyes blazing with determination as she turned to face Doris head-on.
We keep going,
she said firmly, her voice ringing with newfound strength.
We don't stop until we've uncovered every last secret, every last lie that the Garden Circle has been hiding.
Doris nodded, her own fear giving way to fierce, unshakable resolve.
Whatever it takes,
she said steadily.
We'll see this through to the end.
As the two women stood together in the chaos of the studio, the unnatural chill slowly dissipating from the air around them, they knew they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. The forces arrayed against them were vast and powerful, the secrets they sought to uncover dark and dangerous. But at that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder in the face of the unknown, Betty and Doris knew they were stronger together than they ever could be apart. They had each other, and that was enough to give them the courage to press on, to face whatever horrors lay ahead with unwavering determination and unshakable resolve. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and they would stop at nothing to bring it to light, no matter the cost. As the wind died down and the canvas stilled, Betty and Doris exchanged a long, meaningful look, their eyes conveying a silent message of solidarity and support. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, and the forces they were up against were powerful and ruthless. But they also knew they had no choice but to press on, to follow the twisting, treacherous path that lay before them until they reached its end. For too long, the Garden Circle had operated in the shadows, weaving its web of lies and deceit with impunity. It was time for the truth to be brought to light, for the innocent to be protected, and the guilty to be brought to justice. Betty took a deep breath, her gaze scanning the cluttered studio with renewed purpose.
We need to go through everything,
she said, her voice steady and determined.
Every scrap of paper, every half-finished painting. There might be clues hidden in plain sight, things that you saw or heard without realizing their significance.
Doris nodded, her eyes sharpening with fierce, unyielding resolve.
I'll start with the sketchbooks,
she said, moving towards a towering stack of leather-bound volumes.
George always hated when I drew, said it was a frivolous waste of time. But maybe there was more to it than that.
Betty's heart clenched at the pain and bitterness in Doris's voice, at the years of suppression and control that had stolen so much from the once vibrant artist. She vowed then and there to do whatever it took to help Doris reclaim her voice, to support her friend as she fought to break free from the chains that had bound her for so long. The two women worked together, their hands moving with deliberate haste as they sorted through the remnants of Doris's past. They meticulously examined sketchbooks and canvases, seeking any hint or clue that could guide them closer to the truth. As the hours ticked by and the sun began to set outside the studio's dusty windows, Betty and Doris slowly pieced together a picture of the dark and twisted world that lay beneath the surface of their once peaceful town. They found sketches of shadowy figures and cryptic symbols, of hidden rooms and secret meetings that hinted at the garden circle's true nature. But even as they made progress, the sense of unease that had plagued them since entering the studio only grew stronger. The air seemed to hum with a strange, electric energy, and the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. Betty's jaw clenched, her hands balling into fists as she fought the urge to run.
We know what you are,
she said, just as Betty was about to suggest taking a break. A sudden, sharp knock at the studio door made them both jump. They exchanged a wary glance, their hearts pounding in their chests as they slowly rose to their feet.
Who is it?
Doris called out, her voice trembling slightly as she moved towards the door. There was no response, only a second, more insistent knock that echoed through the cluttered space like a gunshot. Betty's hand tightened around Doris's arm, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room for any sign of a weapon or escape route. But before either of them could react, the door burst open with a splintering crack, revealing a figure that made their blood run cold. There, standing in the doorway with a twisted smile on her lips and a malevolent gleam in her eyes, was Evelyn Hart.
Hello, ladies,
she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness.
I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss.
The air in the studio grew thick and heavy, filling them with a sense of suffocating dread that made each breath a battle. Betty and Doris stood frozen, their eyes locked on Evelyn Hart as she stepped over the threshold, her movements unnaturally smooth and fluid.
I must say, I'm impressed.
Evelyn purred, her voice dripping with fake warmth.
I didn't think you'd get this far.
We know everything,
Betty said, her voice shaking.
We know about the garden circle's sacrifices and twisted ceremonies.
Evelyn's lips curled into a cruel, mocking smile.
Do you now?
She asked, her eyes glinting with cruelty.
And what, exactly, do you think you know?
Doris stepped forward, anger momentarily overpowering her fear.
We know you're a monster.
She spat, her voice trembling with emotion.
We know you've been manipulating and hurting innocent people for your own sick goals.
Evelyn's laughter was a cold, sharp sound that seemed to stab through the room.
Oh, Doris,
she said, her voice thick with scorn.
You have no idea. The garden circle is so much more than you could ever imagine. We guard a power older than time, a force beyond your wildest nightmares.
As Evelyn spoke, reality itself seemed to bend and distort. The studio walls dissolved like mist, revealing a terrifying, infinite emptiness surrounding them. Betty and Doris stumbled back, their eyes wide with horror as the world unraveled before them.
What is this?
Betty whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howling void.
What's happening?
Evelyn's smile only grew, her eyes blazing with crazed intensity.
This is the truth of existence.
She said, her voice rising to a feverish peak.
The garden circle will tear down the walls between worlds. And you, my dears, get to watch it all burn.
Doris shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she clung to Betty.
No!
She said, her voice choked with terror.
No, this can't be real. It's impossible.
But even as she spoke, Doris knew it was a lie. The proof danced at the edges of their vision, in the nauseating wrongness that made the ground feel like air beneath their feet. Betty's thoughts spiraled as she frantically searched for an escape, for any shred of hope to cling to. But no matter where she looked, there was only suffocating darkness, a ravenous void that hungered to consume them completely.
You can't stop us.
Evelyn said, her voice ringing with terrible certainty.
The plan is in motion, the sacrifice is made. The garden circle will rise, and your world will be ripped away like dead leaves.
Betty's heart raced, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she fought the crushing despair that threatened to overwhelm her. But even in the face of Evelyn's horrifying words, she refused to surrender.
No!
She said, her voice quavering but determined.
We won't let that happen. We'll fight you with everything we have, even if we have to give up everything.
Doris nodded, her own fear hardening into steely resolve.
We won't let you win.
She said, her voice steady and strong.
We'll stop you, whatever it takes.
Evelyn's laughter rang out again, a sound that chilled Betty and Doris to their core.
Foolish girls.
She said, her voice dripping with disdain.
You have no idea what you're facing. The powers at work here are beyond your ability to comprehend or resist.
As Evelyn spoke, reality warped and twisted once more, the void pulsing with sickening, unnatural light. Betty and Doris watched in horror as tendrils of darkness coalesced into grotesque, writhing shapes that defied the laws of nature.
Witness the truth.
Evelyn declared, her voice swelling with manic intensity.
The endless chaos that lurks beyond humanity's feeble grasp. Look into the heart of madness and surrender all hope.
Betty and Doris held each other tightly, their hearts pounding as one as they stared into the abyss before them. They knew they faced an enemy beyond their darkest nightmares, a force that threatened to unravel reality itself. But even against impossible odds, they refused to lose hope. They had each other, and the unshakable belief that the truth was worth fighting for, no matter the price. As the studio crumbled and melted away into nothingness around them, Betty and Doris stood their ground, eyes locked on Evelyn Hart as she towered over them like an angel of doom.
We won't back down,
Betty said, her voice ringing with fierce determination.
We'll fight you to the bitter end, no matter what horrors you throw at us.
Doris nodded, her own resolve burning bright in her eyes.
You may have power we can't understand.
She said, her voice unwavering.
But we have something stronger. We have each other, and the truth on our side.
Evelyn's laughter shook the earth beneath their feet.
Then let the games begin.
She said, her voice thick with cruel delight.
Let's see how long your precious truth lasts against the fury of the abyss.
With those words, the world shattered like glass, reality unraveling in a storm of chaos and insanity. Betty and Doris screamed, their voices lost in the roar of the void as they were ripped away into the heart of the maelstrom, their minds and bodies stretched to the limit by incomprehensible forces. But even as they fell, plunging into the abyss, they refused to let go of each other, their hands locked in an unbreakable bond. They would fight and keep fighting, to the very end. In that moment, on the edge of destruction, Betty and Doris understood they had found something worth fighting for, something that rose above the small struggles of the everyday world. They had found each other, and in each other, the courage to face the impossible, to challenge the very nature of reality for truth and justice. So they fell, diving into the heart of the abyss, ready to face any horror that awaited them with unshakable bravery and resolve. The final battle had begun, and they would see it through, whatever the cost. A deafening crack of thunder shattered the fragile tranquility of Rosewood Falls, causing Betty Monroe and Doris Fletcher to flinch involuntarily. Their wide, frightened eyes met in a moment of shared terror as they gazed upward, their hearts pounding in unison. The once pristine summer sky had been devoured by a churning mass of inky storm clouds, their roiling tendrils snaking across the heavens like the grasping fingers of an eldritch abomination. Betty and Doris stood frozen, their bodies trembling as they watched the impossible unfold before their eyes. The suburban streets, once a bastion of idyllic normalcy, now thrummed with an undercurrent of menace. Reality itself seemed to warp and distort, the very fabric of existence straining against the onslaught of the otherworldly tempest. With each passing second, the atmosphere grew more oppressive, the air heavy with a palpable sense of wrongness. The acrid scent of scorched ozone assaulted their nostrils, while loose debris skittered erratically across the pavement, propelled by unseen forces. The once familiar neighborhood had become an alien landscape, a twisted mockery of the life they had known. As they ventured deeper into the heart of Rosewood Falls, Betty and Doris were assailed by a barrage of inexplicable phenomena. A parked sedan, its sleek lines and chrome trim a symbol of suburban prosperity, began to twist and collapse inward, its chassis contorting in defiance of the laws of physics. The tortured metal screamed as it buckled, the sound mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. Suddenly, the car's front tire burst free from its warped axle, hurtling towards the two women with uncanny speed. Betty, her reflexes honed by years of investigative instincts, reacted with lightning-quick precision. She grabbed Doris by the arm and yanked her aside, the rogue tire missing them by mere inches as it careened past, slamming into a nearby brick wall with a sickening crunch. Doris, her face ashen and her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, clung to Betty for support.
What's happening?
She whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained hysteria.
This can't be real. It can't be.
Betty, her own thoughts racing with a maelstrom of fear and confusion, could only shake her head in response. She scanned their surroundings, her eyes widening in disbelief as she caught sight of a nearby resident tending to her garden. The woman, her skin as pallid as the flowers she pruned, moved with a grotesque, jerky grace, her limbs contorting into impossible angles. It was as if the laws of anatomy had been discarded, replaced by a nightmare logic that defied comprehension. Above them, the storm clouds had fully blotted out the sky, plunging Rosewood Falls into an eerie, premature twilight. A miasma of writhing shadows wafted between the buildings, amorphous shapes occasionally coalescing into twisted faces before dispersing into vile ichor that rained down upon the desecrated earth. Low, subsonic frequencies vibrated through their bones, emanating from an indistinct epicenter that seemed to beckon them forward. Betty and Doris exchanged a look of trepidation, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had no choice but to press on. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. As they rounded a corner, a piercing scream rent the air, causing them to stumble in shock. A young boy, his face contorted in abject terror, sprinted wildly towards them, his small legs pumping with a desperate urgency. Behind him, an unseen pursuer lurked in the shadows, its presence palpable even though it remained hidden from view. Before Betty or Doris could react, the boy collided with the unyielding asphalt, his frail body crumpling like a discarded ragdoll. They raced to his side, their hearts in their throats, only to recoil in horror at the sight that greeted them. The child's flesh seemed to be melting away, draining from his body like water from a sieve. The ground beneath him had transformed into cracked, parched earth, scrub vegetation pushing up through the fissures like the grasping fingers of the damned. In that moment, as they knelt beside the stricken boy, Betty and Doris understood the true magnitude of their situation. They had abandoned the sanctity of their former reality, crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. The town they had once called home was now a twisted, nightmarish realm, a purgatory of cosmic horror that threatened to consume them whole. With trembling hands and a shared resolve born of desperation, Betty and Doris lifted the boy's limp form, their eyes meeting in a silent pledge to see this through to the bitter end. They had no choice but to forge ahead, to confront the malevolent forces that had laid claim to Rosewood Falls. For in this new, terrible reality, there could be no escape, no respite from the encroaching darkness. As they stepped forward into the hungry maw of the unknown, Betty and Doris knew that they were no longer mere suburban housewives, but soldiers in a war for the very soul of their existence. And though the odds were stacked against them, they would not go gently into that good night. They would fight, with every ounce of strength and courage they possessed, until the final breath was torn from their bodies. For in the end, it was all they had left to cling to in a world gone mad. As Betty willed herself to concentrate on fleeing forward, her vision tunneled until the maelstrom sharpened into a viscous kaleidoscope. Spiral fractals engulfed her peripheral awareness, their mesmerizing patterns suggesting inhuman geometries and alien landscapes that defied comprehension. The very air seemed to pulse with a malevolent sentience, a tangible presence that pressed against her skin like a cold, clammy caress. Beside her, Doris let out a strangled gasp, her eyes wide with unimaginable horror. A swarming, writhing mass had begun to manifest around her, its inky tendrils coiling and uncoiling in a grotesque dance. The entity pulsed with a sickening, insectoid clicking, its multifaceted eyes gleaming with a hunger that could never be sated. Betty, her mind reeling from the onslaught of cosmic aberrations, reached out to Doris in a desperate attempt to intervene. But her movements felt distorted, as if she were trapped in a maddening, slow-motion choreography. Each step, each gesture, was a Herculean effort, a battle against the very fabric of reality itself. In that moment, something within Betty snapped, a fundamental shift in her perception of the world around her. With a sudden, terrifying clarity, she understood that the only way to navigate this nightmare realm was to divorce herself from the constraints of human cognition and sensory processing. She had to embrace the unthinkable, to step beyond the veil of sanity and into the howling abyss that lurked just beyond the edges of her understanding. Closing her eyes, Betty took a deep, shuddering breath and let go of everything she had ever known. In an instant, her mind was set adrift, untethered from the anchors of physical reality. She became a pure consciousness, a mode of awareness floating in the vast, incomprehensible expanse of the cosmos. And with that release came a flood of revelations, each more staggering than the last. Betty saw the macrocosm and the microcosm, the infinite and the infinitesimal, all woven together in a tapestry of sublime, overwhelming significance. She glimpsed the true nature of the universe, a churning, seething ocean of chaos and creation, where worlds were born and died in the blink of an eye. But even as she marveled at the scope of her newfound understanding, Betty felt a creeping sense of dread, an instinctive awareness that she had strayed too far, dug too deep. The entities that swarmed around them, the amorphous shapes that twisted space into blasphemous configurations, were mere reflections of their own refusal to accept enlightenment. They were the manifestations of their stubborn, futile attempts to cling to the illusions of individuality and free will. A distant howling filled Betty's mind, a cacophony of unspeakable tongues that rippled across her consciousness like a tidal wave of madness. She felt herself fragmenting, her very essence unraveling in the face of the eldritch truths that assailed her from every angle. Beside her, Doris's body contorted, her flesh rippling and reshaping itself in ways that defied the laws of physics. In a sickening, instantaneous transformation, her form recoalesced around a transdimensional spinal column, a twisting, writhing pillar of pulsating energy that thrummed with an alien heartbeat. Betty, her own body racked with spasms of agony, felt the violation of her physical form as extraneous nerve clusters bonded themselves to foreign cortical matrices. Her mind, once a sanctuary of self, was now a battleground, a landscape of searing pain and unimaginable horror. Through the haze of suffering, Betty glimpsed the outlines of a sprawling, cyclopean colossus, its immense form assembling itself through their hijacked anatomies. It was a being of impossible dimensions, a godlike entity that dwarfed their pitiful human understanding. With a sudden, terrible realization, Betty understood the true nature of their cosmic meddling. They had not been fighting against the cult's machinations, but rather, they had been unwitting pawns in a game whose rules they could never hope to comprehend. Their very presence, their stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable, had catalyzed the awakening of an ancient sleeper, a primordial intelligence that had lain dormant in the depths of the cosmos for eons untold. Doris, her body now a twisted amalgamation of flesh and eldritch energy, let out a keening wail that reverberated through the very foundations of reality. Her eyes, once a vibrant green, now glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, twin portals to a realm of madness and despair. Betty, her mind teetering on the brink of oblivion, reached out to her friend, her fingers brushing against the writhing mass of tendrils that had once been Doris's arm. In that moment of contact, a jolt of searing agony coursed through Betty's body, a pain so intense that it threatened to shatter her very soul. But even as she reeled from the onslaught of sensation, Betty felt a flicker of something else, a tiny spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. It was the last remnant of her humanity, the final bastion of her identity in the face of the all-consuming darkness. With a Herculean effort, Betty wrenched herself free from the grip of the eldritch forces that sought to claim her. She staggered backward, her body racked with tremors, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions.
Doris.
She croaked, her voice a ragged whisper.
We have to fight this. We can't let them win.
But even as the words left her lips, Betty knew that they were a hollow platitude, a futile gesture in the face of the cosmic horror that had engulfed them. The Colossus loomed above them, its massive form blotting out the sky, its very presence a testament to the insignificance of their mortal struggles. And yet, in that moment of utter despair, Betty felt a flicker of something else, a tiny glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished. It was the realization that, even in the face of the unimaginable, even when confronted with the vast, uncaring expanse of the universe, the human spirit had the capacity to endure. With a final, defiant cry, Betty grabbed Doris's hand, her fingers interlocking with the writhing tendrils that had once been her friend's flesh. Together, they stood before the Colossus, two insignificant specks of consciousness in the face of an all-consuming darkness.
We won't surrender,
Betty whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling of the cosmic winds.
We'll fight until the very end, no matter what it takes.
And with those words, Betty and Doris plunged headlong into the heart of the maelstrom, their bodies and minds battered by the forces of an uncaring universe, their spirits unbroken in the face of the ultimate adversity. They knew that they might not survive, that their struggle might be in vain. But in that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder against the darkness, Betty and Doris understood that there could be no other choice. They were the final guardians of humanity, the last bulwark against the encroaching shadows. And though the odds were stacked against them, though the very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling around them, Betty and Doris would not yield. They would fight, with every ounce of strength and determination they possessed, until the bitter end. For in the face of the cosmic horror that threatened to consume them, in the face of the vast, uncaring expanse of the universe, the only thing that mattered was the unbreakable bond of their friendship, the indomitable spirit of the human soul. And so, as the Colossus bore down upon them, its massive form blotting out the last vestiges of light, Betty and Doris stood firm, their hearts beating as one, their minds united in a final, defiant stand against the darkness. They would not go gently into that good night, would not surrender to the all-consuming void. They would rage against the dying of the light, until the very last breath was torn from their bodies. For in the end, it was all they had left to cling to, the only thing that could give meaning to their existence in a universe that cared nothing for their struggles. And though the path ahead was shrouded in shadow, though the future was a gaping maw of uncertainty and horror, Betty and Doris would face it together, bound by a will that transcended the boundaries of space and time. In the heart of the cosmic maelstrom, two insignificant specks of consciousness stood tall, their spirits unbroken, their hearts ablaze with the fire of human resilience. And though the darkness threatened to consume them, though the very foundations of their world were crumbling beneath their feet, Betty and Doris knew that they would never surrender, never yield to the all-consuming void. They were the guardians of humanity, the final bulwark against the encroaching shadows. And they would fight, with every ounce of strength and determination they possessed, until the bitter end. Pulsating rhythms throbbed in concussive waves, a carnal cadence that rattled marrow and sinew long before any source of that subsonic resonance emerged. Doris spun in dizzying revolutions, searching for its epicenter, one hand clutching Betty's tattered sleeve as her sole tether mooring herself against utter sensory disintegration. Compelled ever onward by forces outside subjective comprehension, Betty and Doris found themselves inexorably drawn to the churning heart of the cult's cosmic ritual, a violation of reality itself within the twisted remnants of Rosewood Falls. The environment distorted with each stuttering revelation, landscapes melting into visceral fleshscapes of slithering, pulsing sinew and blasphemous bioarchitectures gestating into disturbing primordial forms. The air tasted of decomposing meat and brackish salt carried on a fetid wind. Wet gurgles and viscous slurping sounds accompanied every organic heave and metabolic pulsation from the fleshy terrain surrounding them. A forest of engorged vein ridges twitched between patches of puckered, oozing pustules, each eruption birthing torrents of bone shards and embryonic viscera that grated across the terrain. What began as mounded organic structures blistered and burst, expelling clouds of noxious spores that clotted the atmosphere with parasitic pollens and caustic ichors that ate away at their garments until the skin crisped with necrotizing burns upon exposure to the potent, bilious storm. Betty tried calling for a panicked retreat, but the ground surged upwards in gnarled, calcified mockeries of ancient trees, engulfing Doris's legs before the bony trunks spasmed in erratic cadences, flaying hide from her ankles with every piston rupturing the membrane. A resonance built amid the carnage until they realized the sounds were Doris's own screams, rebounding across the reddening hellscape that now came awake with profane, sentient intentions. This was no mere environment, it was the manifesting essence of something so ancient and twisted that even its waking distortions tore acrid rents across objective realities, previously obscuring this higher dimension's unfurling emergence. Betty could only watch in abject horror and helplessness as Doris's flesh peeled away in ragged layers, exposing the splintered bones and thrashing musculature pulsating rhythms telegraphed across tortured nerve clusters. It wasn't a scene of visceral mutilation but glorious transcendental reformation viewed from a limited, subjective perspective as one more shell cast off. Reaching deep within embattled psyches stripped of reason, Betty and Doris made one final defiant choice: to transcend their delusion of finite selfhood by releasing all ego-based clinging whatsoever. If this terminal realm intended to sunder the mundane and welcome them as offerings, their existences would choose to embrace that truth with all spiritual will against its agonizing inevitability. Psychic scars seared across their subjugated psyches as Betty and Doris experienced an eternity trapped in solipsistic nirvana before the cycle of perpetual rebirth finally completed. Their lingering human shells atomized into disassociated strings of quantum data, becoming the raw material for this cosmic transcendence. But just as quickly as those quivering threads breached the final veil, a presence more palpable than any mortal perception reassembled their identities one final time. Doris choked out a scream as her body instantaneously recoalesced around a transdimensional spinal column manifesting inside her sternum. Betty experienced her own abject violation as extraneous nerve clusters bonded directly to foreign cortical matrices, interfaces bleeding into every neural pathway. Blazing electromagnetic disruptions distorted their vision, but somehow through searing afterflares, they perceived the outlines of a sprawling, cyclopean colossus assembling itself through their hijacked anatomies and stolen selfhoods. A basso profundo tremor resonated, an attempt at communication they could almost comprehend in all its shattering scope. An ancient sleeper had awakened, drawn through cosmic birthing waters catalyzed by all their ritual interference. Despite cosmic oblivion embraced, Betty and Doris returned to suffocating sentience only as parasitic tributaries sustaining some squirming, slithering corpus that could not be. All defiance, ambition, and notions of heroic valor were exposed as pitiful self-gratifying delusions when faced with the eternal subjective reality now unfurling its tendrils across this pallid speck of manifold creation. A gibbous moan erupted from that endless gullet, the birth cry of infinite revelation tearing across their essence, followed by more guttural proclamations shattering the eggshell of dimensions they once futilely persisted within. This was the true realm, the eternal and inescapable, and their meddling had only served to rupture fresh wounds across reality's delicate veils. In that moment of distilled, existential anguish, Betty and Doris understood they existed only as fleeting fragments, never the true voyagers they envisioned. All they had glimpsed before could only hint at this ultimate revelation blooming to corrupt and devour all subjective delusion across eternity, spooling in every nanosecond, the cosmic root they ignorantly nurtured now poised to consume as revelation and reality converged across totality. They had uncovered irrefutable proof of the cult's occult practices and political machinations buried in cryptic texts, but having personally encountered Evelyn's terrifying power unleashed, Betty now questioned if even hard evidence could break the High Priestess's far-reaching control.
On another spine-chilling journey, where nightmares come to life and horror knows no bounds. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're brave enough, step through the door and subscribe to Sinister Serials, where every day brings a new flavor of fear, from macabre Mondays to thriller Thursdays. And don't forget to check out our other terrifying tales waiting to be discovered in our library of horror. Until next time, keep the lights on if you dare.